So we're going to read Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. And I'm very grateful when you see it that Ruth's reading that and not me. Thank you.
This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Solomon the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam the father of Abijah, Abijah the father of Asa, Asa the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat the father of Jehoram, Jehoram the father of Uzziah, Uzziah the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz, Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, Manasseh the father of Ammon, Ammon the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel the father of Abihud, Abihud the father of Eliakim, Eliakim the father of Azor, Azor the father of Zadok, Zadok the father of Achim, Achim the father of Elihud, Elihud the father of Eleazar, Eleazar the father of Matan, Matan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Thus there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah.
Leading up to Christmas, we often take a break from our series where we are in the Bible. We turn to Matthew, we turn to Luke, the familiar suspects. We might turn to Colossians. We may go back 800 years to Isaiah the prophets, but there are certain passages we look at each Christmas. Matthew and Luke both start with these family trees, these genealogies. And if you are below 30, and perhaps if you're above 30, you think, isn't there something else you could start with? What's the point? Why can't you speed up? What's with all the long names that no one can pronounce unless your name's Ruth? Why is it here? And why can't we get to the good stuff? I hope that as modern readers we can see, as we dip our toe into this, into Matthew's gospel in the coming few weeks, we can see why it's here and the richness of it. It's so important that it's there. It's very, very significant. We lose the significance of it that the ancient readers, they would understand and they would lap it up and they would be keyed into the gospel story immediately. They see the first sentence, verse 1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Two big names in that sentence that would prick up any Jewish ears immediately. And they would be, as it were, on the edge of their seats. We need to spend some time thinking about this, because if we skip over or say, let's get to the good stuff, or don't pay any attentiveness to these sentences, it is to our loss significantly. So what do these sentences mean? As we journey towards Christmas Day, what do these sentences mean that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, was born as a human? 3 nuggets, I think, from this passage. At Christmas, the promise came true. Don't get to that conclusion too quickly, but at Christmas, the promise of God came true. Grace breaks all the categories, and reality became fact. That's what Christmas is all about. Number 1, at Christmas, promise came true. Now here we are, verse 1. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the promised King, who was the son of David and the son of Abraham. Now, talk about a smash of cymbals that you see at a classical music concert, or a great riff that comes in to start a film like Back to the Future in the good old days. Here we have these two massive symbolic people, King David and Patriarch Abraham, in sentence one of the whole of the New Testament, and immediately we should be on the edge of our seats. A promise was made to both of them, Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, three key chapters in the life of Abraham and in the book of Genesis and in the whole gospel story. Abraham, I will give you protection, a name, I'll give you a land. I'm going to make your name into a great family. Descendants will come from you, and the whole world is going to be blessed through what I will do through you. Now get out and trust me. Genesis chapter 12. 1 Samuel 7, that's where you flick to if you want to understand this sentence and what it means to David. 1 Samuel chapter 7, if Abraham was the patriarch, David was the king. And the promise came to King David. David, I know that you're a shepherd boy, but here's something for you to chew on. Someone from your family line will sit on the throne of my people for all eternity. Next time you're out tending the sheep, think about that. So one's a prophet, one's a king. And these two massive promises come to these two significant people in the history of Israel. And Matthew and Luke start with the genealogies, but Luke also whacks in something for a bonus feature if you're on DVDs. It says this, you have Mary's song, it's called the Magnificat. It's a fancy name of saying song, Mary's song of adoration. So you could go to Luke chapter 2, verse 54. In summary, it says this, listen out. God has remembered to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, just as he promised. So these huge promises that are made to ancient people, that Jewish hearers would say, yes, we know all about those people. As Matthew begins the story about Jesus, he says you cannot understand Jesus unless you understand how Jesus is the answer to every promise made to Abraham and to David and to lots of other people as well in the Old Testament. The meaning of Christmas, among other things, is this. God always keeps his promise. If he makes a promise, he always comes through with it. Now, can I show you something from this that's very important for us to understand in our immediate Amazon 24-hour delivery, DPD next day delivery, immediate society? It's a very, very important lesson from these sentences. Look how long it took for God to fulfill the promise. Just take a moment to think about that with me. It's centuries after he made the promise to King David. Centuries. But how long is it since he made the promise to Abraham? It's millennia. It's thousands of years. But he did keep his promise. That's the lesson. Something very important for us to remind ourselves for or learn from. Sometimes God takes a long time to keep his promise. Sometimes you're on the road to promises being kept, and it can feel like God's not working to keep his promise at all, in the slightest. And so we can ask these questions in summary. Are you there? Do you care? Remember what's happened? There's this single page between Old and New Testament if you've got a paper Bible. Remember those paper Bibles? There's one sheet of paper that you could remove. That might be helpful for you because it's one story from Genesis to Revelation. But before this sentence is written, verse 1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. There has been 400 years of silence. 400 years of a promise not coming true, at least. Prophecy had died out between Malachi, it's the last book of the Old Testament, and Matthew, that's the first book of the New Testament. God's prophecy has died out. God appears to be mute. He appears to be disinterested and far away. Prophecy has died out before Jesus was born. Not only that, kings have died out before Jesus was born. The lines of David seems to have come to an end. And the last thing we heard of in the Old Testament was God's people were taken off to exile. And then the next time we hear from God's appointed prophet, Matthew, What's happened? You're like waking up from a bad dream. They're now under the boot, the heel, the rulership of Rome. Where's the God of promise? It looks like God was going to keep his promise. It looked like history was going in one direction. We had the prophets, we had the kings. But then history took a massive detour. Then there was exile. Then there was silence. Then there was a bit of a return. But then there's 400 years of silence again. And now we have this sentence that's going right back to almost the beginning. Remember that promise to Abraham? Genesis 12, 15, 17. Remember that promise to David? That's 1 Samuel 7. In other words, not only did the promise of God go centuries and centuries without God fulfilling his promise, it looked like history was going in a completely different direction. And it looked like God has fallen asleep at the wheel of history. But then Jesus came. And when Jesus came, he was greater. He was the greatest Messiah, the only Messiah, but he broke all the categories. And he was the greatest king, greater than anyone had ever imagined. Friend, this is our God. It's so important to remember this. Here's the application point, the starter for 10. God always keeps his promises, but he never operates on our time frames. He will not be held account to our needs or our time frames. Even the way in which he works to fulfill his promises is something we cannot see. We've just sung these words. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. You fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds you so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. It looks sometimes as if God is abandoning us. But in the end, he will give you more than you can ever want or imagine. And the main part of the Christian life is to learn that one lesson. It's to trust God and to see his trustworthiness. Because Christmas is about promises that came true. Number 2, grace changes all our categories. God's grace changes all our categories. It's not quite so obvious to see, but as Ruth read those names, you may have glazed over, not because of her, but because of the names, at about verse 3 or verse 5. But here are 5 names that need to be noted, and they are 5 women. Verse 3, Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. That's number 1. Verse 5, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. That's number 2. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. That's number 3. Verse 6. David was the father of Salmon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. We don't know her name from Matthew's record. And then verse 16 at the very bottom, there's Mary. 5 women. Now you may be thinking, what's the big deal? In every society, if you want a place in the world, you need to have credentials. You need to be able to get through the barrier, whether it be a club that you're trying to get into and you need to be a certain age, whether it be a profession that you're trying to make a name for yourself in, you need to have a certain CV. Oh, you went to that school, you're welcome. You went to that school, there's the door. You worked alongside them, that's brilliant experience. We want people just like you. That's the purpose of a CV, a curriculum vitae, to say, here's my record and I measure up to what you need. In fact, I exceed what you need. And so I am what you need. Please give me the job with a salary bump. So that's the point of a CV. But in the ancient Near East, they didn't have CVs, they had genealogies. It was not about what was on the paper, about what you achieved. It was whose family you were born into. And that's why Matthew and that's why Luke record the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew's written to a Jewish audience. So there is a pricked up from verse 1, the 2 big hitters, Abraham and David, they're mentioned. Now who's next? And as you read through verse 2 and following, 5 big surprises are included, and then there are 5 women. You would only have someone in your CV, you would only have someone in your genealogy rather, if you were proud of them. If they were a shady Uncle Cyril, they would not make it into, sorry if you've got an Uncle Cyril, by the way, they would not make it into your CV. They would not make it into your CV. They would not make it into your genealogy. You leave out people who who were the black sheep of the family. You leave out people who would cause discord to be on your name or in your home. The only people listed in the ancient world would be the patriarchs. It's a patriarchal society. That means men ruled. That means men did everything. That means men had all the authority and women were treated really, really badly. And so what's Matthew doing, including 5 women? Eyebrows would be raised, and not just a tweak, they would be raised considerably. Because Matthew is explaining the gospel in a genealogy. That's the whole point. He begins here, and the rest of the New Testament explains the truths of these sentences. Let's look at it closely. Verse 5, Ruth. Remember Ruth? Ruth's a Moabitess. Verse 5, Rahab, she was a Canaanite. So straight away you have 2 women. They're not Jews, is what we need to hear in modern ears. They're despised, they're marginalized, they're outsiders, they're not welcome here. That's the 2 people that we first meet in verse 5, those 2 women. More than that, look at verse 3. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Tamar had these 2 boys with Judah, her father-in-law. Now that's called incest. And if you read Deuteronomy and Numbers, you will recognize the punishment for incest is severe. They should be permanently excluded from Israel. And here's Matthew saying, this is what I want you to understand as you begin the good news of Jesus. These people are in Jesus' family. They're included in the genealogy. They're named. And that means, to some degree, the one at the end is proud of every person in the genealogy. And so straight away in verse 5 and in verse 3, we've met Ruth, Rahab, and Judah, whose mother was Tamar. And we've met racial outsiders, gender outsiders, moral outsiders, and moral people. And Matthew is saying these people are part of the family line of Jesus, which means he approves of them. You're in the family tree. Your name is on record. You're owned. And we are proud of you. And we want everybody who reads the genealogy to see that you're part of our family. Now that's not all. Ruth, Rahab, did you notice the strange spot, verse 6, where a woman's name is mentioned by inference. By inference, look at verse 6. David was the father of Salmon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Now we know it's Bathsheba. Matthew, why don't you just write Bathsheba? Is that an error? Did he have a kind of a mind blank? Did he run out of ink and then forget where he was? No, it's intentional, it's deliberate. Because the way it's written is always carefully written under the influence and guidance of the Holy Spirit. So Matthew is deliberately not saying Bathsheba. He deliberately calls her Uriah's wife on purpose. So that when we go there mentally, there's a mental link to say you could now need to rehearse the story. You need to rehearse the story. He's not throwing shade at her in modern language. He's throwing deep, dark shade on David. That's the point. David, of course, is the greatest king in the history of Israel. He's the one that everybody wanted in their family lineage and history. And yet, verse 6, Matthew says, Uriah's wife, go remember the story of what David did, who's also in the family line. Remember Bathsheba, if you've forgotten? Bathsheba is Uriah's wife. David fell for her. Perhaps it was lust that turned into love. And in order to get her, he had to arrange for Uriah to be killed. A hit job was arranged on him as the army retreated and Uriah was murdered. All so that he could get, as it were, his hands on Bathsheba. And in one stroke, Matthew deliberately says, I want you to remember that story and what David did, because David is in the family line of King Jesus. In other words, King David is no better than the prostitute. There's Rahab, verse 5, there's Ruth, and then there's David. Matthew's saying David the king has no more right to go into the presence of a holy God than Rahab does, than Ruth does, than you or me do. That's the point. Anyone who relates to King Jesus relates on sheer grace, the sheer grace of God. It's God's initiative, it's God's love, it's God's pursuing, strong, sufficient grace that makes people like you and me part of his family. We're eternally lost. And the genealogy says you're eternally loved. That's the gospel, and we're just in the first 17 sentences of the whole of the New Testament. No matter how low you are, you need God's grace. No matter how much of an outsider you are, you need God's grace to welcome you in so you're part of God's family. It doesn't matter how high you are. As the King of Israel, no higher post. You need God's grace, high and low alike. And it's such an incredible message that the whole of the New Testament is needed to unpack it and to explain it. Now, here are two things practically, two kind of takeaways. Friends, if you are in Jesus' family, then, and only then, do you have a name. You will never get a name through your achievement. You'll never get a name through being connected to royalty. The only way you get a name, a self, as it were, an identity, and an honor, and a significance that lasts is being part of the family of Jesus. Think of these kooky, strange names that were real people in history. They're strange to us. These names are 2,000 to 4,000 years old, that kind of number. And yet here we are thousands of years later, and we remember them because they're part of the family line of Jesus. These names have not perished, and they never will for anyone connected to Jesus. That's the only possible reason. It does not matter how much money they've made. It doesn't matter. A king, it doesn't matter if you're a king or a lowly person. If you're part of the family of Jesus, you have a name that will last into eternity. It doesn't matter what you've done, good, bad, indifferent, average. If you're part of the family of Jesus, you are known and you are loved. You're approved of and you're accepted. Eternally lost outside of Jesus, eternally loved in Jesus. That's the point. It's all about being connected to Jesus Christ. Guarantees your salvation, your approval, his smile and his love is over you. It does not matter if you establish a company. Your great-grandchildren will not remember you. Your great-great-great-grandchildren, they've not got a hope of remembering you. Your name will not last. If you're an inventor, it will pass. You'll get an entrance on Wikipedia, and that's about it. But if you're part of the family of Jesus Christ, you will be remembered on into eternity. Think about this. Do you know the honor of being a Christian? To be in the genealogy of Jesus, to be part of his forever family means this. Jesus Christ is proud of you. He's proud of you. He knows what you've done. He knows what you've seen. He knows what you should have done and could have done. And yet he is proud of you. He sings over you, says Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 17. That's love and pride and adoration of what he has done in the gospel. Oh, but he's so ashamed of me. No, he's not. Hebrews chapter 2. Jesus is not ashamed to call us his brothers and his sisters. You leave this room, there is shame aplenty. But in Christ, you can be given a new name. When you toss and turn in bed because someone has snubbed you, what does it matter if they snubbed you or ignored you? If you have been hurt by someone, it can be hurtful. But remember who loves you. Remember who's proud of you. Remember who's adopted and chosen you before the world was made by his lips and fingertips, as it were. Who cares what the peasants think when you've got the voice of a king who sings over you? Here's another one. Inside the Christian church, we must not be like the world is. We must have different categories for love and acceptance and approval. Matthew Henry is known to some of us. He was an ancient Bible commentator, Matthew Henry. And he's a writer. His father's name was Philip, who did not come from the right side of the tracks. You know what I mean? He was a bit of a rough diamond. He wouldn't have gone to private school. He wouldn't have gone to the university, anything like that. He was poor and he was needy and he's the wrong side of the tracks. However, his wife came from the right side of the tracks. And she was something of a go-getter. She had a name. She had a big financial backing behind her. And her mum and dad said, "We're not that happy with you intending to marry this man. Do you know what side of the tracks he is from?" At one point, they said, "We don't even know where he's from. And so she turns to her parents and says this: I don't know where he's from. All I care about is where he's going. His pedigree and background don't matter. It's where he's going. Now, we need to hear this in our individualistic age where we have to create an identity, and we're so concerned about what people say and think and do towards us. God's grace is an identity that is received, it's given, it's not earned. It's bestowed upon us by the benevolent love of Jesus. It does not matter where you've come from. It really matters where you're going. And you can be part of his family even this afternoon. Almost said this morning. Number 3, finally, reality. Reality becomes fact at Christmas. Reality becomes fact. This is an inference, really, from this passage rather than saying chapter and verse, let me show you where it is. Matthew and Luke begin with the genealogies. They begin with the family trees of Jesus. They begin with the stories of Jesus' birth, his life, his death, and on into his resurrection if you read the whole gospel. But notice where it begins. Verse 1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. It does not say, once upon a time. I've got a story to tell you, once upon a time. Now, you will know these two names. J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a brilliant fantasy writer and wrote many, many books. He had a great friend who was an atheist. He didn't believe in God or that God was good or that God existed. His name was Charles Staples Lewis. Once they were walking around a famous walk in Oxford, and they were having a conversation about the great stories, the great myths, the great legends, and the wonderful stories of old. And they were saying things like, how different, this is Lewis to Tolkien, how different these stories are from the realistic fiction stories that were written at that time. Okay, so the old stories with the old values, where you see things like stepping outside of time, or time travel, or good triumphing over evil, or people escaping from death. Those old stories that we all enjoy, how different they are from realistic fiction. We want stories where good overcomes evil, where the girl gets the guy or the guy gets the girl. That's what we want to see in our stories and on our screens, and so on. At one point, Lewis said this: I love the old myths, legends, and stories, but myths are lies, though breathed through with silver. They're breathed through with silver. Tolkien turns to him, it's written in his diaries, and he says to Lewis, no, they're not. No, they are not. Think about this story, said Tolkien to Lewis. There was once a man in an obscure village, a nobody, and he was found to have great power and resources, and he could resist evil. He's raising children from the dead. He's stilling the storm. He's feeding the multitude. He's casting out demonic forces and people. He's loving the poor and marginalized. He's really making a difference. And then he's betrayed, and then he's put to death, and then hope is lost, and the story looks like it's ended. But wait. Miraculously, he's raised from the dead. What does that sound like? Says Tolkien to Lewis. That sounds like another one of those great stories that is factually untrue. But it's so moving and it's so wonderful. The point is, this story is different. It does not start with once upon a time. It starts verse 1 with this is the genealogy, the historical record. In other words, this really happened. Go and look at the history books. Go and investigate. Tolkien said, in fact, Jesus Christ is God's ultimate reality, becoming fact, breaking into the real world. That's the claim of Christianity. It's the claim of Christmas. It's not once upon a time. It's God by his grace breaking into the real world to rescue a lost and needy people. Think about this as we close. If Jesus really was born in a real manger, if he really was raised from the dead, not a legend, but it actually happened, and you believe in him, then all the things that we want to read in stories and see at the ending of films that satisfy our hearts will come true. All of them. Here are a few. One day, if you believe in Jesus, if he's your Lord and Savior, you will step outside of time and you will escape death. One day, your love relationships will go on forever and ever, and good will triumph over all evil. That's the great claim of the gospel. It's the stuff we long for in the stories. And Jesus, by the way, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David and the son of Abraham. Jesus is the reality who's become fact, who's become real. In other words, point 3 proves point 2 of this message. It's the reason the prostitute and the king, they're equally lost, but they're equally rescued and loved because of Jesus. If Jesus is just a legend, all he can ever be and do is a great example. But if reality became fact, then he can be a savior. Here's some lyrics to close. Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. Hail the incarnate deity. Pleased as man with man to dwell. Jesus, our Emmanuel. You can be someone Jesus is proud of, no matter what you've done, because Christmas is not once upon a time. Rather, it's in the beginning of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham.